They didn't call it menstruation. They barely called it anything at all. But it was there, between the folds of coarse fabric, behind the closed doors of stone cottages, soaked into cloths that were washed in rivers before dawn and hung to dry behind barns where no one would look. Blood was not just hidden, it was silenced. And for women in medieval Europe, from the 12th to the 18th century, it was a monthly curse wrapped in cloth and shame, never to be spoken of, never to be seen. There were no pads, no tampons, no painkillers, no understanding, only fabric, often rough linen scraps from old garments, reused until they fell apart. Women cut these pieces into strips, tucked them into their undergarments, and prayed they'd stay in place. They didn't. And when they slipped, when blood leaked and stained a dress, the shame that followed could burn hotter than the cramps that twisted their insides. There was no excuse, no explanation. You were dirty, you were careless. You were indecent. Some women, especially among the poorest, had nothing. No cloth to spare, no rags to cut. In rural areas, they used hay, moss, even animal fur, not because they were unclean, but because they had no other choice. These materials scratched the skin, caused infections, and left wounds that never healed. Yet there was no mercy. No one wondered why she walked stiffly or flinched when she sat. It was simply her burden to carry. If this story has stirred something in you, if you recognize even a fragment of yourself, your mother, your grandmother in these words, then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so these untold histories are never forgotten again. Because silence may have shaped their past, but it won't define our future. But the cloths weren't the worst part. It was the secrecy. Girls learned early that this thing happening to their body wasn't to be named. Mothers didn't explain. They warned. Don't let anyone see, they said. Change your rags in private. Wash them when no one's around. And never talk about it. So the first blood came like a betrayal. Girls thought they were dying. Some believed they'd sinned. And when they asked for help, they were met not with comfort, but with cold instructions. What to hide, how to clean, and most of all, how not to speak of it ever again. The cloths used to absorb menstrual blood were often boiled in iron pots after use. If a woman was lucky enough to have access to fire and water, but even the act of washing these rags carried danger. In towns, if a woman was seen cleaning bloodied cloths, she might be called impure, she might be gossiped about, excluded from religious spaces, or worse, accused of witchcraft. Blood, after all, was powerful, sacred, dangerous, and no one wanted to be near a woman who carried it so openly. Men didn't understand it, and most didn't want to. In many households, husbands would not allow menstrual cloths to be washed in the same water used for dishes. Some forbade their wives from sleeping in the same bed during those days, fearing contamination. In certain regions, menstruating women were made to sleep on straw in separate rooms, or even outside the main house. These were not written laws. They were customs, traditions, whispers passed from one generation to the next. And they were enforced with brutal consistency. The silence created more than shame. It created danger. Women bled in secret. And when something went wrong, when the bleeding didn't stop, or came with fever, or turned black, they said nothing. There were no midwives for menstruation, no remedies for hemorrhage. You were expected to suffer quietly. And if you died, it was your fault for being a woman in the first place. Even in noble courts, where silks replaced linen and baths were more accessible, menstruation was hidden behind velvet curtains and rigid etiquette. Ladies of rank had their maids dispose of cloths, clean the floors if blood dropped, and keep silent at all costs. If a woman bled through her dress at a banquet or court event, it could ruin her reputation. One story, whispered from chamber to chamber, tells of a noblewoman whose gown betrayed her during a royal dinner. She fled before the servants noticed, but the stain remained on the bench. The next morning it was talked about in riddles and symbols, never naming her, never naming the blood, but everyone knew, and her invitations ceased. This silence bred superstition. In many villages, it was believed that menstrual blood could kill crops, sour milk, or even weaken steel. Blacksmiths refused to let menstruating women near their forges. Farmers made girls stay away from the fields during their time of the month. And if something went wrong, if a baby was stillborn, if an animal died suddenly, it was often traced back to a woman who had bled and dared to move freely. The cloths became symbols of a quiet war. Women hid them under floorboards, behind stones in barn walls, or beneath firewood piles. Some buried them after use, too afraid to leave a trace. Others burned them, whispering prayers that the smoke would not carry their shame into heaven. It wasn't just about hygiene, it was about survival. In a world that treated their blood as a threat, they learned to disappear every month, fading into shadows and silence. Yet despite the horror women endured, they shared secrets in hushed voices. Older sisters passed down tips to younger ones, how to fold the cloth tighter, how to boil it cleaner, how to walk without letting the stain spread. It was resistance in the form of routine, survival in the shape of habits no one ever saw, and even when they cried alone in the night, clutching their stomachs, biting their lips against the pain, they rose the next morning, cleaned the cloths, and bled again. There are records from convents where nuns kept journals and coded language, marking their cycles not with words but with symbols, small crosses, dots, or flower petals. Even in isolation, they weren't free. The church taught that menstruation was a mark of Eve's sin, a divine punishment, and so they confessed their cycles as if confessing a crime. Some fasted during their periods, believing that blood made them unworthy of prayer. Others begged for penance, crying for forgiveness over something their bodies did naturally. And still, they bled. Through war, famine, plague, and persecution, the blood came, month after month, cloth after cloth, pain without relief, stains without support. Girls bled through their dresses while fleeing soldiers. Women bled alone after childbirth with no one to care. Elderly women whispered about their last period as if speaking of a ghost finally laid to rest. And the world kept turning, but the story never stopped. It simply faded into silence, tucked between chapters of history written by men who never bled. They said it was God's punishment, that the blood was a curse handed down to women because Eve dared to eat the fruit. Because she questioned, because she acted. From the pulpit to the hearth, this belief seeped into every corner of life in medieval and early modern Europe. A woman's cycle was not biology, it was penance, proof that she was born stained, flawed, in need of control. Menstruation wasn't just a natural function. It was divine justice, flowing out once a month to remind her who she was. Priests didn't preach about it directly, but they didn't need to. It was embedded in every sermon about purity, every cautionary tale about female weakness. Religious texts of the time described the female body as porous, unstable, leaking. Blood was framed not just as impure, but spiritually dangerous. And so the cycle became a spiritual sentence. A woman was not just bleeding, she was paying a monthly tax for the sin of her gender. Women were forbidden from taking communion during their periods. They were not to handle the Bible, light altar candles, or step onto sacred ground. It was said that their touch could desecrate holy objects. And though many questioned these rules in silence, they dared not speak. Because if the church said you were impure, then you were. And there was no one to argue with God. This belief went beyond religion. It carved itself into medicine, philosophy, even law. Physicians of the time, almost exclusively male, believed menstruation was a process of purging. They wrote that women's bodies produced more blood than men's, and the extra needed to be expelled. If not, they said, it would build up and poison her mind, leading to hysteria, madness, even possession. They warned that if a woman's flow stopped, she might become dangerous, violent, wicked. No one asked what happened when a man grew sick. But when a woman did, they checked her cycle first. Midwives, some of the only women allowed to speak about female health, walked a dangerous line. Their knowledge was deep, passed down through generations, but always under suspicion. If they helped too many women too well, they were accused of witchcraft. If they failed, they were blamed for the deaths. Menstruation was central to their work, tracking cycles, understanding irregularities, easing pain with herbs, but they had to speak in riddles, avoid certain words, and always remember who was listening. One German text from the 16th century warned that a menstruating woman who looked into a mirror too long would see the devil behind her. Another warned men not to sleep with their wives during their cycle, claiming it would drive them to madness or infertility. These weren't fringe beliefs. They were widely accepted, printed, distributed, and preached, and women absorbed them even if they didn't believe, because survival meant silence, agreement, submission. A woman who questioned too much, who spoke too freely about her body, could be accused of spiritual rebellion. In some cases, this led to excommunication. In others, it led to something worse. Girls learned early to see their bodies as battlegrounds. When the first blood came, it wasn't met with celebration. It was met with fear. Not just fear of pain, but fear of what it meant. You were now a woman, and with that came danger. Not because of what you'd done, but because of what your body would do, again and again without asking permission. The bleeding meant you could bear children, but it also meant you were weak, unstable, a liability. Men could rise in the church, lead armies, write laws, but women? They bled. And that, to many, was enough to disqualify them from leadership, from autonomy, from voice. There are letters from women of the time, preserved in archives, written in delicate Latin or local dialects, where they beg for forgiveness for missing church services, not because they were lazy or sick, but because they were bleeding. They begged for understanding from priests, for leniency from husbands, for grace from God. And often, they received none. These beliefs traveled across countries and classes. From the courts of France to the villages of Poland, from noble women to servant girls, the message was the same. Your body is flawed, and your blood is proof. In some communities, women were even made to wear different garments during their periods, not as a matter of hygiene, but as a mark of separation, a sign that they were unclean. These clothes weren't bright. They were dull, heavy, intentionally modest, a visual cue to others. Stay away. Don't touch. Don't speak. But the greatest cruelty wasn't the clothing or the rules. It was the isolation. Women were told that their bodies betrayed God, that their cycles were reminders of divine disappointment, and they carried that weight in silence, month after month, year after year. There were no words for the emotional toll, no space to say, "I'm in pain," or "I am scared." No prayers for relief, only rituals of guilt and rituals of silence. Some women fasted during their periods to prove devotion. Others inflicted small wounds, believing that more pain would make them more pure. The blood inside was not enough. They had to show God they were sorry on the outside too. In convents, some nuns believed their menstruation was a barrier between them and holiness. They wept in their cells during those days, afraid that God could not hear their prayers over the sound of their own bodies. One wrote in her journal that she felt banished from grace, even though she had done nothing but bleed. And still, they bled. Even in a world that told them their blood made them less, they endured. They lit candles with trembling hands. They walked into churches even when told to stay away. They raised daughters and passed on what little knowledge they had, how to survive, how to endure, how to keep going even when heaven itself seemed to disapprove. The belief in menstruation as punishment didn't vanish with time. It evolved. It buried itself deeper. And the women who lived under it left no monuments, no statues, no books, only traces, faded letters, burned cloths, quiet prayers whispered behind closed doors, and the hope that one day someone might see them not as sinners, but as survivors. They had no words for it, no lessons, no warnings. A girl's first period was not an introduction to womanhood. It was a sudden, terrifying secret she was expected to handle on her own. There were no conversations, no explanations, only panic and shame. And if she asked too many questions, she was scolded or silenced. In Europe, between the 12th and 18th centuries, menstruation wasn't just misunderstood, it was forbidden knowledge. And for most women, it remained that way for life. Mothers didn't explain it because their mothers hadn't. It was a cycle of silence passed from generation to generation. Daughters were expected to observe, guess, and adapt. The first blood often arrived while they were still children, 11, 12, sometimes younger. One moment they were helping churn butter or sweep the floor. The next they were staring at a dark stain on their undergarments, convinced they were dying. Some believed they had been injured. Others feared they were cursed. And when they finally told someone, the response was rarely gentle. "You're a woman now," was the closest thing to a blessing they would hear. But it didn't come with guidance. No one explained what to do, how to deal with the pain, how often to change the cloths, what to eat, what to avoid. Instead, they were handed a rag, sometimes clean, sometimes not, and told to keep it hidden. The message was clear. No one should know what's happening to you, not your brothers, not your father, not even your friends. In many households, menstruating girls were expected to continue their chores without pause, no matter how severe the bleeding or pain. They fetched water, baked bread, cleaned floors, and cared for younger siblings, even when doubled over in agony. Complaining meant weakness. Asking for rest meant laziness. The work didn't stop because the blood didn't stop. And so they pushed through, often in silence, often alone. The lack of understanding bred myths. Some believed that if you looked at a menstruating girl, you could catch her unbalance. Others said her shadow would curse livestock or spoil fresh milk. It was not uncommon for young girls to be sent to sleep in separate parts of the house, on cold stone floors in storage sheds or even with the animals, so that their impurity wouldn't affect the household. In schools, if a girl was lucky enough to attend, there was no mention of female anatomy or bodily functions. If she stained her dress in class, the humiliation was unbearable. Other children mocked her, teachers ignored it, and when she returned home in tears, she was blamed for not being more careful. Her pain was dismissed, her fear was invalidated, her dignity was erased. Even among sisters, the topic was rarely discussed. They might pass each other a rag in secret, whisper a word of warning when the blood came early, or help wash a soiled garment behind the barn. But the conversations were brief, coded, drenched in discomfort. To speak openly about menstruation was to break an unspoken rule, a rule that governed not just behavior, but worth. A menstruating girl was considered unpredictable, even dangerous. If she was too emotional, too quiet, or too bold, it was blamed on her blood. If she cried too easily, it was her blood. If she challenged an unfair chore or refused to eat, it was her blood. Her body became the scapegoat for every mood, every decision, every moment of resistance. And that blame followed her into womanhood. Mothers often told their daughters to avoid sitting on church pews during their cycle, lest they stain sacred wood. They were instructed to avoid cooking, especially meals for men. And they were told never, never, to leave traces of their cloths where someone might find them. If a rag was discovered by a brother, a neighbor, or worse, a man outside the family, the consequences could be severe. She could be labeled filthy, impure, or even mentally unstable. In some communities, blood on a garment could be used as proof of a woman's unworthiness. There are records from small European towns where women were denied marriage proposals after rumors spread about their uncontrolled bleeding. The shame was so intense that some girls refused to leave their homes during their period, hiding indoors for days with nothing but a bucket of cold water and whatever cloth they could find. But for poor families, hiding wasn't an option. Girls who worked as maids or in fields were expected to labor without interruption. There were no breaks for pain, no moments of privacy to clean themselves. They bled into their clothes and kept moving. Some used herbs or ashes to try to stop the flow. Others tied cloth tightly between their legs, praying it wouldn't shift while they bent over crops or scrubbed stone floors. The mental toll was crushing. To be punished for something you didn't understand, couldn't control, and weren't allowed to discuss created a constant undercurrent of fear. Some girls began to associate their bodies with danger, their blood with failure. They flinched at the thought of growing older. They dreaded the next month before the last one had even ended, and it didn't get better with age. Many women carried this silence into their marriages, afraid to tell their husbands when they were bleeding. If a man found out, it could lead to arguments, disgust, or violence. Some husbands demanded to know when their wives were impure so they could avoid them. Others refused to speak to them during that time, treating them as though they were infected. There was no tenderness, no space for compassion, only distance. Girls were taught not to question, not to complain, and most of all, not to speak. Because once you broke the silence, you were no longer safe. Once you named the blood, you gave it power. And power for a woman in that world was dangerous. But sometimes, quietly, secretly, girls found each other. In the corner of a stable, by a river's edge, or in the back of a cold kitchen, they whispered stories, shared tips, offered a fresh cloth when someone ran out. They stitched hope into each rag they passed, into each knowing glance exchanged across the room. It wasn't a revolution, but it was resistance. And it was the beginning of something their mothers never had. Still, they bled. Still, they suffered. Still, they remained silent. Not because they were weak, but because they were never given permission to speak. Pain was not acknowledged. It was tolerated, expected, dismissed. The women of medieval and early modern Europe bled in silence, and they suffered in silence too. Cramps that doubled them over, bleeding that lasted for days, nausea, dizziness, migraines, these weren't seen as medical concerns. They were part of being female. And being female, in those centuries, was a condition to be endured, not understood. There was no word for menstrual cramps in most common languages of the time, no diagnosis, no remedy. If you cried out in pain, you were accused of weakness, hysteria, or sin. If you dared to rest, you were lazy. If you asked for help, you were ungrateful. Pain was seen as part of your nature, something to be borne like childbirth, like poverty, like obedience. It was your role, your cross. Your silence was your proof of virtue. The few women who did speak of pain were often punished. Some were ridiculed by their families, others by the communities they lived in. A girl who complained about bleeding too much might be branded as attention-seeking. A woman who admitted to fainting or shaking during her cycle could be accused of being possessed. And once that rumor began, it was almost impossible to shake. In wealthier homes, there were attempts at herbal remedies, not based on science, but on trial, error, and centuries of superstition. Sage, pennyroyal, mugwort, yarrow. These plants were boiled into teas or pressed into poultices. Some worked to ease the cramps. Others, like pennyroyal, were dangerously toxic and often used in desperation, not just to stop the pain, but to end a pregnancy caused by rape or forced marriage. The line between healing and harm was razor thin, and many women crossed it in secret. Some women chewed on bitter bark or swallowed hot stones. Others tied warm cloths soaked in vinegar around their waists, hoping the heat would numb the ache. But nothing truly worked, because none of these methods treated the underlying truth, that women were bleeding without support, day after day, year after year, in a world that told them they deserved it. In the countryside, peasant women had fewer options. There were no apothecaries, no skilled midwives, only old wives' tales and whatever they could grow in the garden. One such tale advised placing a toad in a pouch and wearing it around the neck to draw out the pain. I suppose. Another suggested sleeping with raw onion under the bed to confuse the blood. These ideas seem absurd now, but to a girl with no access to care and constant agony, even the strangest remedy was worth trying. Some remedies involved risk beyond the body. A woman who gathered certain herbs at the wrong time of day, or who whispered over boiling water, might be accused of witchcraft. If her neighbors believed she could stop pain, they might praise her. But if they feared her, they might turn her in. Several women were executed not for spells, but for possessing too much knowledge about the female body. The line between healer and witch was drawn by fear. Doctors, nearly all male, were rarely consulted. Menstrual pain was beneath them. When they did speak on the subject, their advice was often cruelly ignorant. Some said women needed more sex to regulate their blood. Others suggested bleeding with leeches to balance the humors. In one widely circulated 15th century medical text, a physician argued that melancholy of the womb could be cured by marriage, because a husband's presence, it was claimed, would settle the blood. These weren't fringe beliefs. They were mainstream, taught at universities, preached in churches, and enforced in homes. There were no heating pads, no rest days, no ibuprofen, only work. Women worked through the pain, kneading dough with trembling hands, hauling water with blood running down their thighs, smiling at lords and children while their stomachs twisted into knots. And if they collapsed, they were scolded. If they bled through their dress in public, they were shamed. But the shame didn't stop at the skin. It seeped inside, embedding itself deep into their sense of self. Many women came to believe the pain was their fault, that they had eaten the wrong food, thought the wrong thoughts, touched something forbidden, prayed too little. Some confessed their periods in church, not as a natural event, but as a failing. They knelt before priests and begged for forgiveness for bleeding too long, too often, too heavily. This shame was taught early. Mothers warned daughters not to look men in the eye when they were bleeding, not to speak too loudly, not to touch children. "You're different this week," they whispered. "Be careful." Oh, the message was clear. Your blood changes you. It makes you dangerous. It makes you less. And for those whose cycles were irregular or didn't come at all, the consequences could be worse. A young bride who failed to bleed was suspected of infertility. A maid who bled too much was seen as unstable. A woman whose cycle disappeared might be accused of carrying a devil's child. The expectations were rigid, but the understanding was non-existent, and the margin for error was fatal. There are stories of girls locked away during their periods, not because they were bleeding, but because they reacted to it, screamed, cried, fainted. Their families, unsure of what was happening, assumed madness. Some were sent to convents, others to asylums. One record from 17th century France tells of a girl who began her period at age 12 and was locked in a cellar for 3 days by her aunt, who believed she had been cursed. The girl survived, but she never spoke again. Still, they carried on. Because what choice did they have? They learned to walk without showing pain, to smile through cramping, to hide the stains before anyone noticed. They learned to listen for the creak of the floorboards when they boiled their cloths at night so no one would see the blood in the water. They memorized every old woman's advice, every half-whispered remedy, every superstition that offered even a glimmer of hope, and they taught their daughters to do the same. Because in a world that refused to help them, refused to name their pain or believe their suffering, women became each other's doctors, each other's teachers, each other's lifelines, and even in the worst moments, when the blood soaked through their skirts, when the cramps made them scream into the straw, when the shame felt like it would crush them, they held on to each other in ways the world never saw. There were no mirrors in most homes. But women didn't need reflections to know the shape of humiliation. They could feel it in the heat, rising to their cheeks when a stain appeared, in the way heads turned in the village square, in the whispers that fell silent the moment they stepped into a room. Menstrual blood was supposed to be invisible, unspoken, untraceable. Yet when it broke through, when it marked clothing, or left a scent, or soaked a bench, it turned into a public spectacle. Not just a biological event, but a threat to a woman's dignity. And so, they built their wardrobes not for beauty, but for protection. Garments became shields, layers were armor. A woman's clothing was not just meant to cover her modesty, it was designed to hide her shame. Skirts were sewn with extra folds of fabric, thick underlayers meant to soak up what couldn't be stopped. Petticoats were dark, often brown or deep red to mask any spotting. In some areas, women crafted rudimentary belts from rope or leather to hold cloths in place. Others stitched pockets into their linen undergarments. Primitive, uncomfortable, but necessary. These methods were never standardized. They weren't taught in books. They were learned through painful trial and error, passed down in whispers from mother to daughter. One woman might use a folded square of wool. Another, strips of torn apron. The poor made do with whatever they could find. Burlap, moss, even paper if it was available. Nothing was sanitary. Nothing was truly absorbent. Everything was a gamble. And when those makeshift protections failed, the consequences were immediate. Staining your dress could mean ridicule, exclusion, or worse. In some towns, it was considered indecent exposure. In others, an omen. There are reports from 17th century England of girls being punished for vulgar leakage in church, forced to kneel in gravel as penance for their bodies betraying them in a sacred space. Even accidental stains on shared furniture could lead to accusations of disrespect or rebellion. The blood wasn't just yours, it became everyone's business. And now I wonder, where are you listening from? Which corner of the world holds your story? Let me know in the comments, because every voice, every memory adds another thread to this fabric of truth we've just begun to unravel together. It's hard to grasp the daily vigilance this required. Imagine walking through mud and rain with layers of cloth between your legs, knowing that if one shifted an inch, you might be marked. Imagine sitting on a stranger's chair and wondering if the warmth you felt was just the cushion or something worse. Women planned every movement with care. They avoided light-colored clothing. They stood instead of sitting when possible. They folded their shawls around their waists as a backup shield. Every gesture was a calculation. Every choice, an attempt to stay invisible. But visibility wasn't always something a woman could control. There were no painkillers, no calendars, no tracking apps. Cycles came irregularly, unexpectedly. Some women bled for 5 days, others for 2 weeks. Some had no symptoms. Others were struck with cramps so intense they fainted in the field. There was no predictability, and therefore no safety. Even the most prepared could be caught off guard, and often were. What made it worse was the sensory betrayal. Blood has a smell, a warmth, a heaviness that clings to the fabric and refuses to go unnoticed. Women described feeling sick in the soul when they realized their scent had reached others. It wasn't the blood itself, it was what it represented, that you had failed to hide, that you had let your private torment bleed into the public world. This fear seeped into everything. It dictated social behavior, limited freedom of movement. Many women chose not to leave the house during their period, not because they were ill, but because they couldn't trust the makeshift protections. They missed markets, church, visits with relatives. Some used their period as an excuse to avoid unwanted attention from men. Others, trapped in abusive homes, had to endure the opposite, being shamed or punished for staining shared bedding despite having no means to prevent it. And for the women who worked, especially domestic servants, milkmaids, or washwomen, the risk was even greater. A stain on the wrong tablecloth or pillow could cost them their job. There are records of housemaids dismissed for leaving unclean cloths in laundry piles. In one chilling account from a noble estate in Bavaria, a maid was beaten for bleeding on a bedsheet she had just ironed. The blood wasn't treated as human, it was treated as filth, a contamination. And she, by extension, was seen the same way. Fashion responded to these unspoken dangers. The layered skirts, the dark linens, the tightly bound waists, these weren't only aesthetic, they were armor, designed to keep the world from seeing the truth of what it meant to be a woman. And yet, the irony was cruel. While women were forced to hide their blood, their worth was still tied to it. A girl who didn't menstruate properly was considered barren. A woman who bled too often, too heavily was suspicious. The blood had to exist, but only in secret, only when convenient, only in silence. Even in death, the rules lingered. Midwives preparing bodies for burial sometimes checked for blood to determine purity at death. If a woman had died while menstruating, some communities believed her soul would wander. Unclean, unfinished, families lit candles for extra nights. Priests murmured extra prayers. It wasn't just about biology, it was about legacy. Your cycle followed you beyond the grave. Yet women continued to resist, not by defying these expectations, but by surviving them. They learned how to stitch extra padding into their clothes, how to change rags quickly in public restrooms, or behind bushes, or in barns. They timed their errands to avoid the heaviest days. They wrapped wool around their waists to soak up sweat and blood. They burned stained cloths at night so no one would see the evidence. And they shared. Quietly, carefully, they passed knowledge, told stories, offered tips, warned each other, helped each other hide. Their survival wasn't written in books or carved into monuments, but it was sewn into every layer of fabric they wore, hidden in the folds of dresses, whispered between sisters, lived in silence, but never truly alone. Because even when society demanded invisibility, women saw each other, understood each other, and in those small, unseen acts of care, one cloth offered, one stain forgiven, they built a resilience stronger than shame. There were locks that clicked at sunset, heavy doors that closed with a finality that didn't just keep people out, it kept women in. In parts of Europe during the late medieval and early modern periods, menstruation wasn't just stigmatized. It was treated like a form of contagious madness, something to be quarantined, controlled, hidden away behind stone walls or wooden gates. And for many women, their monthly cycle was not a time of rest or privacy. It was a sentence that came again and again and again. Some were confined to their rooms during those days, not by choice, but by force or pressure. Their mothers told them it was for their own good. Their husbands said it was to protect the home. Neighbors expected it. Communities enforced it. If a woman bled, she was expected to disappear. Not figuratively, but literally. Stay in bed. Don't touch anything. Don't prepare food. Don't sit at the family table. Don't walk barefoot in shared space. In some villages, even the ground she walked on was considered tainted. In more extreme cases, women were locked in barns or cellars, especially if they lived in households where superstition mixed freely with control. One chilling account from rural Austria in the early 1600s describes a woman who was made to sleep in the goat pen for 5 nights every month. Her husband believed her blood would poison their crops if she stayed near the kitchen. She left no letters, no journal, just a name in a parish record and a single line in the village archive, kept apart for safety. But the idea of being kept apart wasn't always voluntary. Sometimes it was ritual. Sometimes it was punishment. In parts of Eastern Europe, there were folk customs that required women to observe menstrual seclusion. Though not official law, it was deeply ingrained in local culture. Women who violated the unwritten rule risked more than just gossip. They could be blamed for stillborn calves, sour wine, or a failed harvest. It was easier for the community to point to a bleeding woman than to accept the chaos of nature. And when misfortune did strike, when the well ran dry, or illness spread, or storms destroyed the fields, there was often a scapegoat. A menstruating woman seen near the church, or in the field, or speaking too loudly. That was all it took. She had violated the natural order. She had called attention to herself. And once a woman was marked in that way, suspicion followed her. Her word held less weight. Her actions were watched. Her freedom shrank. Some women were accused of witchcraft simply because they bled differently. A longer cycle, a heavier flow, blood that arrived at the wrong time of the moon, blood that came with fever. These signs, misunderstood and feared, were seen as evidence of demonic influence. There are cases, documented in Inquisition records, where the only proof against a woman was a cloth stained with blood. No testimony, no confession, just the undeniable, unavoidable evidence of her body doing what it was designed to do. But in a world ruled by fear and myth, that was enough. One of the most haunting examples comes from a 15th century village in northern Italy. A young girl, barely 13, was accused of bewitching her brother. He had fallen ill, likely from fever or food poisoning, but the villagers were convinced she had cursed him. When pressed, the only explanation they could offer was that she had begun menstruating just days earlier, and no one had warned her not to look at him during that time. She was locked in a storeroom for 8 days. No light, no fire, no one to talk to. She survived, but was never allowed back in the family home. The fear of female blood extended beyond just the physical. It became spiritual. The church, especially in the earlier centuries, viewed menstruation as an impurity that separated women from God. Some priests refused to offer communion to women during their cycles. Others demanded confession before allowing women to rejoin the congregation. And though these practices varied widely by region, the underlying message was constant. You are not clean. You are not worthy. Stay away until you are. This alienation wasn't always enforced through violence or confinement. Sometimes it came through whispered instructions, pained glances, or the quiet shifting of a chair when a woman approached. Social spaces shrank, respect withered, and slowly a woman learned that her body didn't just isolate her physically, it isolated her socially, emotionally, spiritually. And yet, the most tragic part is how often women believed it. They internalized the message that they were unclean, that they were dangerous, that their blood, natural and unchosen, made them less worthy of touch, of trust, of dignity. Some even took part in their own confinement, secluding themselves out of fear, out of shame, out of the desperate desire not to be blamed for something they couldn't control. But others, quietly, cautiously, began to resist. There are stories, sparse and hard to verify, of women who refused to be locked away, who demanded the right to stay in their homes during menstruation, who dared to speak up when accused. One account from the Basque region of Spain tells of a woman who challenged her village priest after he forbade her from receiving the Eucharist. She told him, in front of others, "If Christ bled for me, then why should my blood shame him?" The priest was silent. She never received the sacrament, but neither did she leave the church. These small acts of defiance didn't spark revolutions, but they mattered. They planted seeds. Seeds that would not bear fruit for centuries, but would remain rooted in the soil of resistance. Still, the fear of blood never fully left the cultural fabric, and the punishment for breaking menstrual taboos remained harsh. In parts of Germany, during the witch trials of the 17th century, interrogators asked detailed questions about women's cycles. A woman who bled too often, or not at all, or at the wrong time, was considered suspect. Her cycle became evidence. Her biology, a weapon against her. Even today, some of the language from that era lingers. Words like unclean, hysterical, moody carry echoes of centuries-old beliefs. They were born in rooms where women bled alone, afraid to speak, afraid to be seen, afraid to be locked away again. But those rooms were not empty. They held voices, muffled though they were. They held stories, unspeakable though they seemed. And in each of those stories, in every woman who endured isolation, humiliation, or accusation, there is a thread of survival. A quiet, stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished. A truth that kept burning, even behind locked doors. They called her a witch because she bled too much. In a world where medicine was superstition and fear wore the robes of righteousness, a woman's blood, if misunderstood, irregular, or merely inconvenient, could become a noose around her neck. From the 12th to the 18th century, a menstruating woman didn't just risk shame or isolation. In the wrong village, on the wrong day, with the wrong kind of blood, she risked death. The line between menstruation and witchcraft was always paper thin, drawn by men who never bled and enforced by those who feared what they could not explain. Menstrual blood was seen as wild, uncontrollable. It was associated with transformation, decay, power, things the church and society wanted to keep locked firmly in the realm of the male divine. But the female body refused to cooperate. It bled on its own terms, and that terrified them. Some believed a woman's blood could sour milk, rot crops, even cause storms. Others whispered that if a menstruating woman touched iron, it would rust. If she passed a child too closely, it might fall ill. If she stared too long at someone, that person might become barren. These weren't strange fringe beliefs. They were repeated in sermons, inscribed in legal texts, passed from grandmother to granddaughter as both warning and inheritance. And when the flames of hysteria began to rise in Europe, especially during the infamous witch hunts of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, these beliefs became bullets. In Germany, court records from Bamberg and Würzburg describe women accused of bewitching livestock after being seen with bloody rags drying in the sun. In Scotland, women who suffered from heavy or irregular menstruation were labeled unclean witches, their blood seen as a sign of communion with the devil. In France, it was said that witches used menstrual blood in spells, smearing it on doorways to invite demons or mixing it into bread to bind a man's will. Even those who didn't practice any form of folk healing, or who had no idea what was being said about them, could fall victim. Sometimes all it took was a coincidence. A woman's period beginning near the time a neighbor's cow died. A girl's blood returning after months of absence, just as a child in the village grew sick. There didn't need to be proof. The blood was the proof, and so the fear became lethal. Bleeding became a risk. Girls were taught to hide their cloths, not just out of modesty, but for their safety. Some burned their used rags to erase the evidence. Others buried them under rocks in the woods or washed them downstream, away from the eyes of their neighbors. Menstrual blood, if found and misinterpreted, could lead to accusations that ended in torture, drowning, fire. In one chilling case from 1580s Italy, a widow named Lucia was accused of witchcraft because a local woman claimed she saw her soaking a cloth red as sin in the public fountain. Lucia tried to explain it was only her menses, a normal part of womanhood. But the town priest disagreed. He argued that no woman should bleed like that, and if she did, it was unnatural, unholy, evidence of a pact with darkness. Lucia was imprisoned, interrogated, her home ransacked for herbs, oils, or writings. Nothing was found, but it didn't matter. Her blood had spoken, she was executed. The silence women had been taught to keep about menstruation now became a trap. If they hid it, they were suspicious. If they were open, they were dangerous. They were caught in a paradox of purity, expected to bleed discreetly, but never too much. To be fertile, but never too visibly so. To be women, but only in ways that made others comfortable. For midwives and healers, the danger was doubled. They were among the few who understood the female body, who knew how to soothe cramps with herbs, how to ease a difficult cycle, how to predict a woman's flow based on the moon or the seasons. But that knowledge, in the hands of women, was threatening, especially if they were poor, especially if they were unmarried, especially if their patients got better. Many midwives were accused of using menstrual blood in witch potions. One German text claimed that a certain spell required 3 drops of blood from the first day of a virgin's period. Another insisted that menstrual blood could darken the light of Christ if placed beneath a church altar. These were fantasies, but they were fantasies taken seriously by courts, clergy, and frightened villagers. And yet, for all their fear, society couldn't live without these women. They relied on them in childbirth, turned to them in sickness, whispered for their help when daughters bled too soon or not at all. The same hands that tied women to stakes had once held out for a remedy, for relief, for help. That was the bitterest irony. Women were needed, but never trusted. Valued, but never safe. The emotional toll of this cannot be overstated. To live with a body that betrayed you each month, and to know that betrayal could cost you your life, was a kind of spiritual torture. Some women prayed for early menopause just to be free. Others turned to dangerous methods to stop their flow, consuming heavy metals, swallowing sharp herbs, starving themselves. The blood wasn't just a cycle, it was a threat, a countdown, a sentence. Even those who escaped direct accusations weren't free. They lived with the constant awareness that one wrong move, one stain, one wrong word, one poorly timed illness could unravel everything. It made friendships fragile, community brittle, sisterhood vital. In secret, women still helped each other. When one was accused, others would sneak food to her cell. When one bled too heavily, her friends would lend extra cloths. When one feared the town's suspicion another might help bury the rags, it was resistance in small, brave acts. It was survival built on trust, not magic. But not every story ends in fire or fear. Some women, even in the darkest times, found ways to rewrite the narrative. Folk stories tell of wise women who used their knowledge of the cycle to predict weather, harvests, even disease. Others claim that a woman who bled during the lunar eclipse had special visions. In remote villages, small pockets of reverence for the cycle survived, buried beneath layers of fear but still alive. These were not tales of power in the modern sense. They didn't change laws or end trials, but they were the seeds of something else, a quiet refusal to disappear. A whispered belief that maybe, just maybe, the blood wasn't evil. Maybe it was life. Maybe it was power. Not the kind that burned villages, but the kind that endured long after the flames had died. They didn't have cotton pads or tampons. There were no sterile wrappers, no adhesive wings, no antiseptic wipes. For women between the 12th and 18th centuries, Menstruation meant improvisation, and often pain. They bled into what they could find, not what was safe. Hygiene was not a concept tied to dignity or self-care, but to survival, and sometimes surviving meant bleeding into straw. Moss was one of the most common choices in Northern Europe. Soft, absorbent, and easily gathered from the woods, it seemed like a natural solution. But moss harbored insects, dirt, and bacteria. Women who used it frequently developed rashes, infections, and open sores, yet many had no better options. They didn't choose moss because it was comfortable. They chose it because it was free. In the countryside, hay was also used. Not hay shaped into pads or covered in cloth, but just dry, scratchy grass layered into folds of fabric or placed directly against the skin. The irritation it caused was unbearable. Women itched until their thighs bled, until walking became agony, and still they wore it. Because hay was always available. Because they could stuff it into old aprons, into makeshift belts, and keep moving. Wool scraps were another option, especially for those in colder regions. Warm, yes, but heavy when wet. Wool trapped moisture, clung to the skin, and caused painful chafing. The odor was hard to hide. The risk of infection was high. Still, many women preferred it over the splinters of straw or the roughness of burlap. In a world of terrible choices, wool was sometimes the least cruel. For those who lived near rivers or forests, bark was occasionally used. Thin shavings softened over fire or soaked in water. It offered structure, but little comfort. It didn't absorb, it deflected. And when pressed too tightly, it could cut. But it was believed to cool the womb, and so women used it, enduring the pain as penance for being born with bleeding bodies. Then there was ash. In some regions, especially during times of famine or war, when even cloth was scarce, women resorted to ash, sprinkled into undergarments or layered between cloths. It was thought to absorb odor. It did nothing for the bleeding, or worse, it irritated open skin and raw flesh. But it was quiet. It left less visible evidence. And when fear of being seen outweighed fear of infection, ash became a choice born of desperation. In urban centers, women scavenged whatever they could, discarded rags from market stalls, bits of paper from books or packaging, even scraps of old bedding. There are letters from servants who wrote about wrapping pages torn from religious pamphlets around their thighs, not out of defiance, but because they had nothing else. The irony of bleeding into holy text was not lost on them, but hunger, shame, and urgency do not leave room for reverence. And what about cleaning these makeshift protections? That too was a struggle. There were no disinfectants, no soap as we know it today. Women boiled their rags in water, if they had access to fire, to pots, to time. In poorer homes, they simply rinsed the fabric in streams or barrels, hung it behind the house, and prayed the stains wouldn't be noticed. They reused them over and over, even when the fibers tore or hardened with dried blood. To throw away cloth was to invite suspicion. To be seen washing it was to risk humiliation. The physical consequences of all this were brutal. Infections were rampant. Sores developed from the friction of straw. Fungus grew in damp wool. Splinters lodged themselves in tender flesh. Some women bled for longer, not because of any disorder, but because their bodies were constantly inflamed. Vaginal wounds became common. Cysts, abscesses, fevers, but no one talked about these symptoms, and few, if any, were treated. A woman who limped from pain, or who struggled to sit without wincing, was rarely asked if she was bleeding. Instead, she was told to be quiet, to be strong, to bear her burden like a wife, like a mother, like a woman. And so she did. But there were worse fates still, times when a woman had nothing at all. In some cases, during travel, poverty, or imprisonment, women bled directly into their clothing, into their skirts, their undergarments, their beds. The cloth stuck to their skin, dried there, tore at the flesh when removed. They slept in it, worked in it, sat in it, even as the smell rose and the pain grew. And when it was over, they washed the garments in rivers or wells alone, scrubbing them until their hands bled too. Some women tried to stop the flow altogether. They bound their abdomens tightly with rope or belts. They consumed herbs known to close the womb, plants like tansy, rue, or even deadly nightshade. These methods were dangerous. Some caused vomiting, hallucinations, or even miscarriage if the woman was unknowingly pregnant. But for those with no access to cloth, pain felt safer than blood. It wasn't just the body that suffered, it was the spirit. Imagine knowing every month that your only choice is to choose which form of pain you'll endure. The raw burn of straw, the itch of moss, the sting of ash, the weight of wool soaked through your skirt, and all of this while pretending nothing is wrong, while cooking, cleaning, smiling, while praying not to be noticed. The cruelty of this system wasn't just that women lacked resources, it was that they lacked the right to speak about the resources they lacked. They bled in silence. They suffered alone. And even when they found something that worked, something that offered relief, it could be taken from them. In one recorded case, a young woman in 17th century France developed her own method, folded linen tied with leather straps. It worked. She could move more freely, bleed more comfortably. But when her employer discovered it, he accused her of being too proud. He believed no servant should bleed in comfort while his daughters still hid rags under floorboards. He burned her creation in the fireplace and docked her wages for the cloth she had stolen. Innovation was punished. Relief was suspicious. Dignity was a luxury for the wealthy or the lucky. And for the vast majority of women, menstruation remained what it had always been, a cycle of improvisation, pain, and quiet endurance. But even then, there was resilience. In market stalls, women passed each other tips and whispers. In convent kitchens, nuns folded cloths for novices in secret. In the woods, old women showed girls which moss to pick and which to avoid. They couldn't end the suffering, but they could soften it, even just a little, and that mattered. Because in a world that gave them nothing, these small acts of care, one scrap of cloth, one word of advice, one stitched fold, were everything. There was no margin for error. A single drop of blood in the wrong place could destroy a reputation. A stain on a bench, a faint mark on a dress hem, a single red thread clinging to a stocking, and the judgment would begin. Not whispered, loud, public, merciless. To menstruate in private was shameful. To menstruate in public was unforgivable. Women lived with this knowledge in their bones. It wasn't just about pain or mess or discomfort. It was about being seen. The terror wasn't always the bleeding itself. It was being caught. Because once someone noticed, once a glance lingered on the wrong shadow of a skirt, the damage was already done. People talked. People remembered. And the stain wasn't just on fabric. It stuck to your name. Girls were trained early to avoid this fate. By 12 or 13, they knew the choreography of secrecy. How to check for leaks without drawing attention. How to sit without spreading their skirts too wide. How to fold an apron over the lap in case of accident. They knew how to look behind them before standing. How to casually drape a shawl across a bench before sitting. How to tie a dark sash around their waist to conceal a sudden bloom of red. These were not taught in school or written in letters. They were passed down like survival codes, and they had to be. Because a public stain was more than embarrassment, it was scandal. There's a recorded account from 17th century Bruges of a market girl who was struck in the face by her employer's wife after bleeding onto a stool during morning bread sales. Witnesses claim the stain was no larger than a coin, but the lady insisted the girl had offended the Lord's cleanliness. The girl was dismissed without wages. Her family, already poor, lost their only stable income. The girl never worked in that quarter of the city again. Not because she was incapable, but because she had bled. And people remembered. This social memory was brutal, especially in small towns. A woman who stained her dress once might be mocked for years. Children made up rhymes. Boys threw stones. Other women turned their backs, afraid of being associated with the filthy one. Even priests refused confession to those accused of parading their woman's curse in daylight. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a cultural web of control that weaponized menstruation. The mere evidence of being female became a reason to exclude, to ridicule, to dehumanize. Men could bleed on the battlefield and be honored. Women bled in silence and were shamed. In some parts of Eastern Europe, menstruating women were not allowed to touch water in public wells. If they did, and someone noticed a stain later, the entire well might be drained and purified with fire. The fear was not of disease, it was of contamination by female essence. And though no one could see the blood in the water, the idea of it was enough to cause panic and punishment. In churches, the rules were even stricter. Women sat at the back or near exits in case they had to leave suddenly. Some pews were covered in darker cloth to avoid visible signs of disgrace. And if a stain was discovered after Mass, rumors flew. It didn't matter who had sat there, all women were suspects. Some avoided church altogether during their periods, not because they believed they were unworthy, but because they couldn't risk the exposure. Fear dictated everything. What to wear, where to sit, how long to stay, how closely to walk behind someone, lest the rustle of cloth reveal something. Even laughter became risky. A sudden movement, a jolt of the body, a shift in posture, these could all betray the delicate architecture of secrecy women constructed every day. And yet, they had no true tools, no adhesives, no elastics, only hope and fabric. Hope that the cloth would stay in place. Hope that the bleeding wouldn't start early. Hope that today, at least, their body wouldn't humiliate them. It wasn't just strangers who judged. Families did too. Brothers mocked their sisters if they suspected the curse had arrived. Fathers grew distant. Mothers grew impatient. Even among women, sympathy had limits. If a friend bled visibly, the others might retreat. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't want the shame to spread. In wealthy households, maids who bled on linens were beaten or dismissed. In poorer homes, girls who stained shared bedding were forced to sleep separately or wash the sheets in freezing water before dawn. There was no margin for complaint, only consequences. And still, despite the risks, despite the shame, women continued to live. They worked, carried buckets, milked cows, walked miles to market. They sat on wagons, danced at festivals, prayed in pews. all the while hiding an ongoing battle with their bodies and their society's rules. Some tried to outsmart the system. They wore multiple skirts, not for fashion, but as backup. One to bleed on, one to hide the blood, one to protect the rest. Some tied charcoal-stained cloths to make spotting less visible. Others added vinegar or wine to their wash water to reduce the smell, hoping to avoid scrutiny. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about survival. But sometimes, despite all this, the blood found its way out. And when it did, it wasn't seen as natural. It was seen as failure. Failure to contain yourself. Failure to behave. Failure to be a woman in the exact way society demanded. Discreet, controlled, invisible. And in that failure, something quietly powerful began to stir. Not rebellion, not yet, but resilience. Because each time a girl walked home with blood on her dress and still held her head high, she refused to disappear. Each time a sister handed her own shawl to cover a friend's stain, she rejected the shame. And each time a woman whispered, "It happened to me too," she cracked the silence. The world didn't stop shaming them, but they stopped letting the shame be a weapon used only against themselves. They walked with blood between their legs and no pause in their step. The women of medieval and early modern Europe didn't have the luxury of rest, not during pain, not during bleeding, not even when their bodies begged them to stop. Their world was relentless. Farms didn't wait, children didn't wait, masters didn't wait. And so, neither did they. Whether they bled for 3 days or 10, whether they doubled over from cramps or soaked through their skirts, they rose with the sun, tied their cloths tight, and stepped into the world. For working-class women, there was no escape from physical labor. Servants bled while polishing stone floors. Washerwomen bled while scrubbing linens in frozen streams. Field workers bled as they bent over rows of wheat, the pressure of their own bodies forcing blood downward faster. Every movement risked a leak. Every twist of the waist or lift of the arms could displace the fragile balance of fabric and skin, and yet they moved. Because to stop was to lose wages. To complain was to be dismissed. To rest was to be replaced. This was especially true for domestic servants, who were expected to be invisible in their employers' homes, present only in service, never in personhood. A stained apron or a visible limp from cramps wasn't just a mark of humanity. It was seen as a disruption. Many mistresses believed menstruation was a sign of uncleanliness that could contaminate food, laundry, or even the moral air of the home. Girls were forbidden from entering kitchens while bleeding. Others were reassigned to outdoor chores, hauling coal, carrying water, tending livestock, labor just as punishing but out of view. In rural areas, where whole families worked the land together, menstruating women had to carry on as usual. There were no exceptions. No one planted the grain for you. No one milked the cow or split the firewood in your place. If anything, women were expected to be tougher than men, because their pain was private and their struggle unspoken. They bled into their undergarments while tilling fields. They hid their cramps behind baskets of apples and wheels of cheese. They kept moving, and they bled. Some tried to manage it with makeshift padding. Others simply let the blood flow, hoping it wouldn't stain through before the work was done. In colder regions, women sometimes sat on stones outside the barn after a long day, pressing their thighs together, trying to will the flow to stop. They didn't cry. They didn't speak. They endured. Even women in trades, bakers, seamstresses, brewers, were offered no leniency. A woman running a bakery had to knead dough with blood on her cloth. A seamstress couldn't stop sewing just because she felt dizzy from blood loss. A midwife might deliver a baby while silently dealing with her own flow. The work demanded it. The world demanded it. And so women adapted. They created routines to change their clothes between chores, choosing moments of privacy behind trees and outhouses in the dark corners of stables. They learned which skirts absorbed best, which undergarments chafed the least, which belts stayed tight longest. They worked with one hand while adjusting a slipping cloth with the other, and if they stained something, they worked faster to clean it before anyone noticed. These weren't acts of convenience. They were acts of survival. There are letters from the 16th century written by noble women to their daughters, describing how to manage bleeding during court appearances, during long horseback rides, during public gatherings. One wrote, "Should it begin while you are speaking with a man of rank, do not show it in your face. Excuse yourself as if for a cough and see to your skirts." Another wrote of the need to tie rosemary around the waist, not for healing, but to hide the smell of the moon's sorrow. Even among the upper classes, there was no true relief. Nobility might have better cloth, more privacy, or servants to help, but the expectations of decorum were suffocating. A stain on a noblewoman's gown at a public event could cost her a marriage proposal. A whisper of unfeminine odor could unravel years of social grooming. And so, their lives too became performances of control, smiling through cramps, standing still through dizziness, curtsying with blood pooling silently beneath their corsets. In convents, the silence was even heavier. Nuns were expected to rise for prayers throughout the night, kneel for hours, and live lives of discipline and spiritual cleanliness. A menstruating nun who bled under her robes during Mass might be forced to do penance, not for the act, but for the disruption. Many isolated themselves voluntarily, believing their flow made them unworthy to pray. Some slept sitting up during those days, afraid that lying down would cause staining. In the quiet of the abbey, their suffering went unnoticed. And then there were the women who traveled, pilgrims, merchants' wives, wet nurses sent to other villages. These women bled while on the road, with no cloths, no privacy, no rest stops. They bled on horseback, in carts, along footpaths. Some packed extra rags in their bags, tied tightly with string. Others bled into straw sewn into the lining of their skirts. One traveler's diary from the 1500s notes the difficulty of changing cloths in open country. The wind nearly took the linen from my hand, and I did pray that no man came along the ridge as I crouched. There was no stopping it. The blood came whether they had help or not, whether they had fabric or not, whether they were tired, sick, hungry, overworked, or grieving. And the world did not bend for them. So they bent themselves. They became experts in subtlety, adjusting their posture to hide pain, timing their chores around their cycles, folding cloths in ways that absorbed more, stained less. They washed their rags under cover of darkness, hung them between laundry days to avoid questions, hid them inside flour sacks or under firewood. They passed knowledge to one another when they could, sometimes with a whispered word, sometimes with nothing but a look. Because while society pretended that menstruation did not exist, women created an entire world of rituals and adaptations just to live with it. But none of these acts protected them from judgment. If blood was found, it meant they had failed to hide it. If their labor slowed, it meant they were weak. If they dared to speak of their pain, it meant they were hysterical. They had no room to be human, only useful. Still, they moved. They bled, and they worked, and they endured. Not because they were allowed to, but because they had to. Because the fire needed tending. Because the children needed feeding. Because the wheat would not harvest itself. And because the world had taught them from girlhood that pain must never interrupt the task at hand. Even when it soaked through their skirts, even when it burned between their legs, even when it hurt to breathe, it came again, always, whether they were ready or not, whether they had cloth or not, whether they were sick, exhausted, heartbroken, pregnant, or recovering from childbirth. It came, and every time it did, it brought with it the same dread, the same silence, the same pain. Menstruation, for women between the 12th and 18th centuries, wasn't just a biological cycle. It was a cruel, inescapable rhythm. A cyclical hell with no name, no relief, and no end in sight. There was no calendar to track it, no reliable way to predict when it would arrive. Women tried, of course. They watched the moon. They counted on their fingers. They remembered the last time it came by linking it to events, a storm, a death, a festival, a prayer. But the body rarely respected memory. It bled when it wanted to, and often when it was least convenient, most dangerous, or most humiliating. This unpredictability meant living in constant fear. Every day, a question. Will it come today? Will I feel the wetness while I'm serving wine? Will the stain appear while I'm on my knees at the altar? Will it begin while I'm cleaning my Lord's bedchamber or holding my child? No warning, no permission. Just a warm trickle, a jolt of pain, and the need to hide it before anyone noticed. And then 5 days of damage control. Maybe 7, maybe 10. No one could say for sure. Some bled heavily, some lightly. Some stopped and then started again. But there was no language for this variance, no medical support, no space to ask, is this normal? Instead, women whispered their guesses to one another in stables and kitchens. I bled for 9 days this month. That's how it was for my mother, too. I was cursed with a heavy womb. These weren't medical diagnoses. They were oral histories, survival tactics. When the blood came, it brought more than physical discomfort. It brought social exile. During those days, women were often expected to keep away from men, food, church, and even livestock. It was believed that their blood could spoil butter, curdle milk, or wither plants. A woman who touched dough during her period might ruin the bread. A woman who walked through a vineyard might kill the grapes. Superstition disguised itself as caution, but its roots were in misogyny. The bleeding body wasn't just seen as impure, it was seen as destructive. So women withdrew, or were withdrawn. Removed from communal meals, left out of family rituals, forbidden from handling sacred objects, expected to sleep alone. Their bodies were a threat to both the domestic and the divine. Even if no one said it aloud, they felt it in the shifting glances, in the way hands avoided theirs, in the sudden stillness when they entered a room. They internalized this exile. Some accepted it as spiritual necessity, others as social law, but many simply saw it as fact. This is the cost of my body. This is the price I pay for being a woman. And then, after the blood stopped, after the cloths were cleaned, the soreness faded, and the stains were scrubbed out, they were expected to return to normal, instantly, as if nothing had happened, as if their bodies hadn't just fought them, as if they hadn't just endured yet another round of pain, secrecy, and social rejection. But even in those clean days, the threat of the next cycle loomed. Women began to prepare again the moment the last one ended. They collected cloth, they boiled water, they scanned their bodies for signs, an ache in the back, a swelling in the belly, a strange dream, anything to give them an edge, anything to reclaim even the tiniest bit of control. Some turned to rituals. Folk traditions passed down from older women suggested ways to predict or lighten the next cycle. Eat more garlic, drink nettle tea, sleep with rosemary under the pillow, braid your hair a certain way, bury your old cloths under moonlight. These weren't spells, they were coping mechanisms, desperate efforts to manage the unmanageable, but many of these efforts came with consequences. Herbs thought to shorten menstruation sometimes caused nausea or hallucinations. Remedies to stop the bleeding could bring fever, infection, even death, and the psychological toll was just as severe. Women who bled too long began to believe something was wrong with them. Women who didn't bleed at all feared sterility, or worse, possession. There was no clear line between the spiritual and the physical, the real and the imagined. And in that blur, pain found fertile ground. Yet the body did not care what they believed. It bled regardless. The cycle returned again and again, and with each return came exhaustion, not just physical, but emotional. The weight of knowing that this suffering wasn't a one-time trial, it was a lifetime sentence. Girls started bleeding at 12, sometimes earlier, and might continue until their late 40s or even 50s. That meant 30 or 40 years, hundreds of cycles, thousands of days spent bleeding, hurting, hiding, washing, fearing, enduring, and always alone. Because no one asked how they were. No one checked if the bleeding was heavier this month or if the cramps had worsened. If a woman fainted in the fields or cried out in the night, it was dismissed as female nerves or lunacy. Some were mocked, others punished. Some were even sent away, locked in rooms, treated with leeches or isolation or religious penance. There are records of women institutionalized for what today we would recognize as endometriosis or menorrhagia, conditions that cause excessive bleeding and pain. But in a world without language for these disorders, they were labeled mad, dangerous, even possessed. Their suffering wasn't seen as biological, it was seen as moral failure. And still they bled. They went back to work, back to prayer, back to childcare and fieldwork and spinning wheels. They scrubbed out their stains with hands already raw from labor. They washed their cloths in secret. They smiled when expected, laughed when appropriate, served when called upon. And they did it all while bleeding month after month for decades. What they endured was invisible to history books, unmentioned in journals, ignored by men who documented everything except the suffering of women. But that silence doesn't mean it wasn't real. It was. It was soaked into every linen, every undergarment, every whispered conversation between sisters, every prayer said quietly in the dark. This cyclical torment, this hidden hell, was not weakness. It was survival. And in surviving it, women forged strength not celebrated in ballads or etched into monuments, but carried in the muscle of their backs and the blood in their veins. They did not rebel loudly, but they resisted daily. With every cloth folded, every pain endured, every stain washed clean before the sun rose. Still, the question remained, when would it end? And what would come after? Because even as the body aged, even as the blood slowed, another kind of reckoning waited just beyond. A final transformation, one last taboo. And women would discover that even when the bleeding stopped, the silence often did not. When the bleeding stopped, it wasn't relief that came first. It was confusion. For women in medieval and early modern Europe, the end of menstruation wasn't marked by celebration or ceremony or understanding. It came slowly, sometimes abruptly, but always quietly, and it left behind more questions than answers. Because if the blood was considered a curse, what did it mean when the curse lifted? Was it freedom? Was it a sign of age, of decay, of divine forgiveness, or final punishment? There was no term for menopause. No shared understanding of what was happening to a woman whose cycle faded. Some called it the drying up. Others whispered that the womb had become cold or dead. And in a world that tied a woman's value to her fertility, to her ability to bleed, to carry, to bear, to nurture, the end of her cycle could feel like the end of her usefulness. No one told her what to expect. No one warned her that the flow might stop suddenly, only to return with a vengeance. That the heat would rise in waves from her chest to her temples, that her heart would race in the middle of the night, or that her joints would ache without cause, that she might feel unsteady, tearful, furious, for no clear reason. And if she did speak of it, it was brushed aside. You are just aging. It's only nerves. Say a rosary. Take some air. The same dismissal that had followed her through every cycle followed her still, even as her body changed again. Some women feared they were dying. Others believed the devil had entered their blood and was now draining away their life. There are stories of women confessing in church, not for sin, but for fear that their womb was rotting, because the blood had stopped. They begged for prayers, not knowing that what they were experiencing was entirely natural. But how could they know? The knowledge wasn't there. No one had told them. No one had told anyone. Menopause, for many, became a second exile, a silent transition, a strange shift into invisibility. They were no longer young, but not yet old in the way society revered in crones or wise women. They were somewhere in between, neither bleeding nor birthing, no longer maid nor mother, just other. And this otherness, too, carried danger. In a culture that had always feared women's blood, a woman who no longer bled was often seen as suspicious. If she lived alone, she might be called a witch. If her body changed shape, if her hair grew coarse, if her skin grew darker from sun or labor, she became a target. Older women were often accused of cursing others' fertility, stealing youth from young girls, poisoning livestock or wells. Many of the women burned during witch trials were beyond childbearing age. They had lost their blood, and in the eyes of men, perhaps their humanity as well. This erasure was not just social, it was spiritual. In churches, older women were still considered impure, even without menstruating. Some were forbidden from taking part in certain rituals, not because they were bleeding, but because they had stopped. The logic was circular, cruel, and absolute. If you bleed, you're impure. If you no longer bleed, you're unnatural. But among women, something else began to form. The end of menstruation brought with it a strange clarity. No longer having to manage rags or stains, no longer fearing the sudden flow during a sermon or while washing clothes, it was a quiet liberation. Some women found energy returning to their bodies in new ways, not spent on childbirth or monthly suffering. Their strength began to gather elsewhere, in their minds, in their voices, in their memories. Grandmothers passed down stories they had never dared tell before. Midwives spoke more freely of their knowledge, no longer worried about being seen as too fertile to be wise. Widows, often dismissed as broken things, found new independence. They managed their own homes. They brewed medicines. They gathered girls around them and said, "This is what no one told me. Listen." Some cultures, though few, held on to older traditions that revered post-menopausal women. Among certain Celtic and Slavic groups, the crone, an elder woman no longer of childbearing age, was seen as closer to the spiritual world. She had passed through blood, pain, motherhood, and silence, and emerged as something more, not weak, not used up, but transformed. In villages, older women became the keepers of secrets. They knew which herbs worked, which neighbors were cruel, which midwives could be trusted. They had bled through wars, famines, plagues, childbirths. They had watched daughters die, lovers disappear, faith shift, and yet they remained, stitched together by survival, scarred but standing. They had outlived the silence, and still they weren't entirely free. Even in old age, shame lingered. They remembered what it was to stain a dress, to be mocked, to bleed in church. The echoes of humiliation never fully left. Some never spoke of it again. Others carried those memories in the way they held their hands, the way they paused before sitting, the way they looked at a young girl with understanding in their eyes but didn't say a word. Because the cycle didn't just stop at the womb. It lived on in memory, in fear, in inherited silence. It lived in the stories not told. And this is perhaps the deepest cruelty of all, that for centuries women suffered in a cycle so profoundly human, so universal, and yet it was hidden, buried, erased. Their blood built generations. It nourished life. It cost them dignity, freedom, sometimes their lives. And the world acted as if it didn't exist. But history cannot silence what is remembered. And today, in the fragments we recover, in the letters, in the confessions, in the court records, in the stained linens preserved in museums, we find them again, not as footnotes, not as mysteries, but as real women, bleeding, enduring, surviving, refusing to vanish. Their blood may have dried. Their names may have faded, but their story continues, not because it was recorded, but because it was lived. Every month, every year, every ache, every stain, every silence cracked by a whisper shared between women. And now we whisper back, not in fear, but in reverence, not with shame, but with the truth they were never allowed to speak. They bled, and they lived, and we remember.